Welcome to Larry King Live. Tonight, life after Gorbachev. The world wonders what comes after the old hammer and sickle. Will the U.S. miss the old reliable rivalry? Now, here's Larry King.
Good evening from Washington and Merry Christmas. And while much of the world was distracted today by the business of celebrating Christmas, Mikhail Gorbachev signed himself and the Soviet Union out of business without ruffles or flourishes. The Russian flag has replaced the hammer and sickle over the Kremlin. President Bush and other leaders spoke well of Gorbachev, and with good reason. Nobody is sure what happens next in the new Commonwealth of Independent States.
Christmas Day, 1991. The Soviet Union no longer exists. Boris Yeltsin is the president of the Russian Federation and the future is looking bright. It's a new world order of neoliberalism, globalization, the internet, the end of history.
It's the 90s, remember?
So how did we get here? In this series, I'd like to tell you the story of why the Soviet Union was doomed to collapse. This is Mikhail Gorbachev, the final Soviet leader and the first and only president of the Soviet Union before its collapse. Venerated in the West, he received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1990 and the Ronald Reagan Freedom Award in 1992, thanks to his efforts in diffusing Cold War tensions and his litany of liberalizing reforms in Soviet society, such as free speech, economic liberalization, and democratization. Yet, within the former Soviet Union, he is remarkably unpopular. In Russia, Georgia, Armenia and Bulgaria, more people surveyed believe that Joseph Stalin had a mostly positive impact on history than they did Gorbachev. Additionally, a 2011 Kommersant poll found that 73% of Russians surveyed could not name a single positive accomplishment of his regime. And in 1996, Gorbachev's run in the Russian presidential election yielded him a mere half a percentage point of the vote. Quite simply, Gorbachev is viewed by many as the man who presided over the destruction of the Soviet Union and all the political and economic turmoil, as well as loss of world influence that came with it. When investigating the case of the Soviet collapse, he doesn't seem like a bad suspect to start with. So, let's go back to the year 1985. On the 11th of March 1985, Gorbachev was appointed as the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, or CPSU. This followed the death of the prior General Secretary, Konstantin Chernenko, and rendered Gorbachev the new leader of the Soviet Union. At only 54, Gorbachev came as a breath of fresh air in contrast to the gerontocracies of the Brezhnev, Andropov, and Chernenko regimes. Gorbachev's culpability in the collapse was the main focus of my undergraduate dissertation, and one of the first things that I wanted to understand before making judgment was Gorbachev's motivations as General Secretary. Where did he come from and what did he want? Gorbachev represented a new generation who had been born after the Russian Revolution and who grew up within the Soviet system. Born in the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, or RSFSR, to a peasant family in 1931, Gorbachev's childhood was spent immersed in the socialist project of collectivization, growing up on a collective farm that was partly founded by his grandfather. And in 1950, at the age of 19, Gorbachev became a candidate member for the Communist Party. After graduating from law school at Moscow State University, Gorbachev rose through the ranks of the CPSU, becoming first secretary of Stavropol City Komsomol in 1956, and then first secretary of the Stavropol region in 1970, automatically making him a member of the Central Committee of the CPSU. By 1980, Gorbachev was the youngest member of the Politburo, and with the appointment of Yuri Andropov to the position of General Secretary in 1982, the new leader found Gorbachev to be a close ally, encouraging him to chair Politburo meetings and preparing him for higher office. Some regime theorists have used the collapse of the Soviet Union as a key example of the way in which regimes formed from revolution are ultimately undone when a turnover in leadership occurs from the revolutionary generation to the next generation. The idea being that, without the revolutionary zeal, ideological adherence is lower, and so reforms are implemented which ultimately undo the cohesion of both the party and the regime as a whole. And whilst this is definitely the case with some Soviet politicians I will introduce later, I don't believe this was the case with Gorbachev. Gorbachev was ideological, and Gorbachev did want to preserve the communist legacy. A key term associated with Gorbachev is new thinking. But was his thinking that new? In his 1996 memoirs, Gorbachev describes how his ascension to leadership did mark a shift away from Stalinism, and right back to the original Leninist ideology upon which the Soviet Union was founded. Indeed, Gorbachev was critical of the then contemporary political leanings of the CPSU, and we know from a speech he gave in 2002 that his criticality was influenced by Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev's 1956 secret speech criticizing Stalin's regime. But ultimately, Gorbachev believed in the original vision of the Soviet project, not in destroying it. And his initial domestic agenda really didn't mark a massive divergence from his predecessors. His initial policy of acceleration, or was focused on improving productivity and efficiency within the Soviet economy, with emphasis on updating scientific and technical production. Not dissimilar to the agenda laid out by Andropov in 1983, who emphasized a need to combat accumulated inertia in the Soviet system. A report by Andropov that was read posthumously in 1984 had specified that Gorbachev should be his successor, and so it would seem that Gorbachev was a natural continuation of Andropov's legacy. Now, was Gorbachev the most ardent, conservative communist within the party? No. We know that a degree of factionalism would emerge from 1986 onwards amidst Gorbachev's later reforms between Gorbachevians and Andropovites, who supported another protege of Andropov. But the point I'd like to emphasize is that Gorbachev did believe in the Soviet project. He was selected for leadership by seasoned party men, and the initial agenda he chose to pursue was generally reflective of the path the Soviet Union was already on. So, where did it all go wrong?
Good evening. There has been a nuclear accident in the Soviet Union, and the Soviets have admitted that it happened. The Soviet version is this. One of the atomic reactors at the Chernobyl atomic power plant near the city of Kiev was damaged, and there is speculation in Moscow that people were injured and may have died. The Soviets may have been fairly quick to acknowledge the accident because evidence, in the form of mild nuclear radiation, had already reached beyond the Soviet borders to Scandinavia.
According to his 2006 article, Turning Point at Chernobyl, the 1986 Chernobyl nuclear disaster was a watershed moment in Gorbachev's policy direction. In Political Fallout, the Failure of Emergency Management at Chernobyl, Edward Geist describes how the conflicting Soviet hierarchies of risk influenced decision-making around this event, particularly between civil defense, which prioritized risk in terms of physical damage and casualties, versus the image concerns, where the risk to political image and the legitimizing myths of the state were prioritized. One such myth was that Soviet nuclear power represented the Union's technological supremacy in comparison to the West, and that it met the Bolshevik promise of electrifying the country. Therefore, such technology was incapable of error. One must be mistaken to suggest that Soviet technology posed a risk to health.
It's delusional.
Previous, less severe accidents occurred at both the Leningraden power plant in 1975 and Chernobyl itself in 1982, but the reactors were put back into service. When Chernobyl Reactor 4 exploded, the plant staff were under-equipped to assess the extent of the damage, with most Geiger counters limited to detecting lower levels of radiation. In the absence of clear information, Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov, the man who'd pushed the reactor to its breaking point, assumed that the reactor core had not in fact been destroyed. He conveyed this information to plant director Viktor Bukhanov, who adamantly asserted to Moscow that the reactor was in fact still intact. While Civil Defense Director Vorobev discovered that in the immediate area of Reactor 4, the radiation level was at 200 roentgens per hour, which is approximately 40% the lethal dose of radiation every hour on hour. Bukhanov dismissed this fact, accepting a much lower reading he'd already been given.
What does the dosimeter say?
3.6 Roentgen, but that's as high as the meter.
3.6. Not great, not terrible.
What about radiation?
Obviously down here it's nothing, but in the reactor building I'm being told 3.6 Roentgen per hour.
Well, that's not great, but it's not horrifying.
As he prioritized the reputation of the Soviet nuclear industry, not to mention himself, as more important than public health. As a result of misinformation downplaying the scale of the disaster, the Soviet government produced a proportionate response which fell far short of what was actually required. And it was not until a commission headed by Boris confirmed through their own measurements that Reactor 4 was in fact destroyed, that the evacuation began for the citizens of Pripyat a full day later, meaning that administrative flaws unequivocally cost the lives and health of Pripyat citizens. Gorbachev was highly disturbed by the difficulty in obtaining information in these initial hours, and he clearly took Chernobyl seriously, now seeing Soviet history through the lens of pre- and post-Chernobyl. This strengthened his resolve to implement Glasnost, or political openness reforms, which were officially designed to promote transparency in government and encourage public criticism of officials and features within the Soviet system which were producing inefficiencies. Chernobyl clearly had a large impact on this, as Gorbachev says in his 2006 article, Chernobyl, more than anything else, opened the possibility of much greater freedom of expression in the Soviet Union. But the true extent and consequences of Glasnost were, as of yet, unforeseen by Gorbachev. This is Alexander Yakovlev, Gorbachev's senior advisor, and in the foreword to the Black Book of Communism, Crimes, Terror, Repression, Yakovlev makes it clear that a very narrow circle of true reformers within Gorbachev's regime aimed to destroy not only Stalinism, but also all revolutionary totalitarianism, dating back to Lenin himself. This was where the real generational turnover occurred, and beyond the ideational shift back to Lenin seen with Gorbachev, these reforms truly marked the abandonment of revolutionary ideology. At the same time, Gorbachev launched democratization, aimed at reducing party control in order to both continue Glasnost despite the resistance of the more conservative party members, but also to continue his policy of Perestroika, or restructuring, another reform which I will touch upon later. He consequently introduced new election laws to promote competition amongst candidates, and most significantly introduced the Congress of People's Deputies, or CPD, which became the highest body of state authority from 1989 and was elected by the general population, though with a third of seats allocated to public organisations. Where we really begin to see the knock-on effects of both Glasnost and democratization is with the rise of one specific man, Boris Yeltsin. Yeltsin was, privately, critical of the Soviet system and would later claim to have read the banned book
called the Gulag Archipelago, and it's by a Russian author, a Soviet author named Alexander Solzhenitsyn,
which exposed life within the Soviet Gulag system. In 1976, Yeltsin became first secretary of the party committee for
Sverdlovsk Oblast,
a region of Russia. Yeltsin was unconventional in his demeanor as first secretary, often appearing unplanned in factories and public transportation to observe Soviet life in earnest. He would answer questions from the public, such as a Q&A session in 1981 at the
Sverdlovsk
Youth Palace, and in 1982 responded to letters on television. But for the most part, Yeltsin was able to get away with pushing the envelope. That was until 1987, when Yeltsin, who had been promoted to being first secretary of the Moscow City Party Committee, resigned in protest at the slow pace of reform, which both entrenched his reputation as a rebel and hard reformer, but also yielded him a demotion to the position of First Deputy Commissioner for the State Committee for Construction, and subsequently resulted in his removal as a candidate member of the Politburo in 1988. However, in 1989, the first multi-candidate elections for Gorbachev's new Congress of People's Deputies presented Yeltsin with an opportunity. In spite of, or perhaps accentuated by, his belligerence and unconventional behaviour, such as appearing drunk at speeches, his underlying popularity as the figurehead of popular discontent within the regime resulted in his election to the Moscow district seat. At the Congress's televised first session in 1989, the consequences of Glasnost became evident. Deputies exercised free expression to directly criticise the Soviet Union. Subsequently, Yeltsin was appointed a seat on the legislative body known as the Supreme Soviet. By July 1989, Yeltsin had announced a new opposition wing within the CPD, the interregional group, and in 1990 he was elected as chairman for the Supreme Soviet of the RSFSR, despite Gorbachev's vocal objections. Finally, in 1991, Yeltsin would further succeed against Gorbachev's wishes when he was elected president of RSFSR. Yeltsin had snowballed to a prime position of power through the new democratic apparatus directly provided by Gorbachev's reforms. And then there was Perestroika. Perestroika was an essential characteristic in the breakup of the Soviet Union's greater empire, the Warsaw Pact of Eastern Bloc socialist states. Gorbachev supposed in 1987 that, having initiated Perestroika, we realized that we had to put an end to the Brezhnev Doctrine, which was the policy of intervening militarily to maintain socialism in non-Soviet states. In seeking to modernize the Soviet economy as part of the restructuring project, the regime was forced to confront the price the Soviet Union was paying to maintain the loyalty of the Warsaw Pact. This new Gorbachev Doctrine would be presented to Warsaw Pact leaders directly at a 1986 secret meeting of COMECON, or the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. As described by Gorbachev's close aide Georgy Shakhanazarov, Gorbachev warned that, moving forward, national leaders would be responsible for managing their own states, unable to call upon the Soviet Union for assistance. This was where Gorbachev's own intentional decision-making did diverge substantially from his predecessors by permitting the right for nations to choose their preferred economic system moving forward. At the 27th Party Congress, socialist internationalism was not mentioned, and in fact, the opposite was asserted. An unconditional respect in international practice for the right of every people to choose the paths and forms of its development. In Perestroika and New Political Thinking for Our Country and the World, work by Gorbachev in 1987, Gorbachev doubled down by asserting the right of every nation to choose its own path. A nation may choose either capitalism or socialism. Clearly, Gorbachev had closed the book on the global revolution of the proletariat, and in encouraging freedom of choice, Gorbachev had inadvertently signalled the possibility for states to defect to the West. And so by 1988, a large swath of nationalist movements had set upon the Eastern Bloc. The abandonment of communism was exemplified by movements such as Solidarity in Poland. Yet, even in 1989, Gorbachev would remain steadfast, reiterating in a speech to the Council of Europe that any interference in the sovereignty of these states would be inadmissible. And ultimately, the fall of the Berlin Wall exemplified Gorbachev's surrender to the tide of change his reforms had unleashed. It was a symbolic end to the Cold War in favour of Western capitalism, and it was being met with praise for the man, Gorbachev, who was meant to serve as its antithesis. Prior to the fall of the Berlin Wall, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher had communicated with Gorbachev that too rapid a reunification of Germany could be undesirable due to the deleterious impact it could have on his political position. And so it had become clear to some in the international community at this time that Gorbachev's reforms could fatally impact his regime and the stability of the Soviet Union. And concurrent to the collapse of the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet Union's own endogenous disintegration had begun. Declarations of independence first occurred in the Baltics, starting with Lithuania on the 11th of March 1990. Following the effective end of the Cold War and the fragmentation of the Soviet Union, rising political instability in Moscow had become palpable. Gorbachev's political survival was now at risk. In a final effort to hold the Soviet Union together, Gorbachev planned to sign the new Union Treaty, which would decentralize power to the individual Soviet republics, due to be signed on the 20th of August 1991. However, a group of Soviet hardliners, including members of the CPSU and the Committee for State Security, also known as the KGB, formed the State Committee on the State of Emergency, later known as the Gang of Eight. On the 19th of August, perturbed by Gorbachev's reforms and averse to a further loss of central power, the Gang of Eight placed Gorbachev under house arrest at his dacha, or holiday home in Crimea, and attempted to introduce a state of emergency in what would become known as the August Coup. This coup attempt was a disaster. Holding a press conference, the Gang of Eight appeared disorganized and nervous. Whilst tanks rolled into Moscow, they were met by large numbers of Muscovite protesters who fortified the Russian White House, whilst Boris Yeltsin climbed atop one of the tanks and denounced the coup, calling for a general strike. Gorbachev refused to resign as General Secretary, and, with no apparent legitimacy, the committee's orders were not being obeyed, and ultimately, Red Army troops failed to launch an assault on the White House. By the 21st of August, the coup had been defeated, and whilst Gorbachev was reinstated, the Soviet Union was fundamentally and irreparably changed. The CPSU was suspended, and Gorbachev lost much of his influence as Yeltsin consolidated executive power in Russia. Further Soviet republics would then declare independence, beginning with Ukraine in August, and by November, Russia itself would spearhead the push to exit the Union. On the 8th of December, Yeltsin, alongside Ukrainian leader Kravchuk and Belarusian leader Shushkevich, signed the Belavez Accords, declaring that the Soviet Union no longer existed. The dissolution of the Soviet Union was confirmed by the Alma-Ata Protocol on the 21st of December, and Gorbachev resigned from the presidency of the Soviet Union on Christmas Day 1991, ceding all executive powers to Yeltsin. So, did Gorbachev doom the Soviet Union to collapse? Despite Gorbachev's belief in original Leninist thinking and his aspirations to keep the Soviet project afloat, his reforms clearly facilitated a series of events which precipitated the superpower's undoing. On one side, Gorbachev's commitment to reform had allowed and encouraged international Soviet influence to disintegrate, and on the other, the clear split between reformers and hardliners had manifest in a disastrous coup attempt that would both politically neutralize Gorbachev and accelerate the Union's demise by empowering more radical reformers like Yeltsin, who had come to power on the back of the political infrastructure of Glasnost and Democratisation created by Gorbachev. A seemingly open and shut case? Well, yes, but actually no. This explanation, while straightforward, leaves us with many questions which remain unanswered, such as, how did the superpower relations between the Soviet Union and the United States throughout the Cold War fit into the equation? Why was the collapse ultimately relatively peaceful compared to, for instance, the breakup of Yugoslavia around the same time? Why did Soviet republics like the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia want to secede in the first place? And ultimately, what exactly were the problems of productivity, efficiency and accumulated inertia described by both Gorbachev and Andropov? I open this video with a quote by American communist Louis C. Freiner, and whilst he was referring to the February Revolution of 1917, which was a key step on the way to the creation of the Soviet Union, I think his quote is equally applicable to the Soviet collapse. The short-term explanation, which depends entirely on the policy direction of the Gorbachev regime, is reflective only of this final revolutionary stage, and fails to include the longer-term factors over further months and years which made the context of Gorbachev's leadership possible in the first place. The questions I have just raised are integral to uncovering these longer-term factors, and I aim to answer them in future videos. So with this in mind, my next video will cover another highly attributed culprit of the Soviet collapse in popular culture, the United States. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. It's my first time ever playing around with any video editing software and certainly recording this much narration. So if there's any glaring issues with editing or audio, I'm sorry, you have my apologies. Even whilst writing my dissertation, I knew that I wanted to translate my research into a media format like this, something accessible and hopefully to teach people something new. If you found this useful for your own personal interest or for school or studies, let me know, that would be great. I've tried my best to include all the relevant historical information I can to tell this story properly, but if you think I've missed anything, also please comment below and I'll address it in future videos. And if you've made it this far, I would of course love it if you could give this video a like and subscribe to the channel to hopefully help this video get some traction. I've already got chapter 2 in the works, so I will see you guys again soon.